Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Erik Bush. I'm the CEO and founder of Demand Driven Technologies. Delighted to be your host and presenter for today's webinar on building supply chain agility through the sales and operations planning process. A couple of footnotes here before we get started on the content. We have everyone in listen-only mode, and we do that so that we can improve the audio quality. But we are very interested in your questions, so please use the question and answer feature on your Zoom control panel if you have questions during the presentation, and we'll be covering those off at the end of the session. Second, we are recording the session, and we will make it available to all the registrants after the webinar, after we get the video processed, so that you can refer to it down the road or share it with any of your colleagues and the like. And then finally, we're also going to be doing some polling questions today, so would greatly appreciate your responses as those polls come along, because they help us gather insights on what you're thinking about and what perspectives you have on the current environment that you're facing, the challenges you're facing, and your feedback on what we're doing here at DD Tech. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and dive in here. We're going to talk about supply chain agility in the context of, got to get my mouse over to the right page, the sales and operations planning process. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to go back to some of the realities. As you know, we're doing this as one of the sessions in a multi-part series. We're trying to really look at and examine how can we shift our planning methods and approaches across the supply chain spectrum to create more agility and resilience. So we'll talk and remind ourselves about some of the realities that we're all facing and why this is becoming such an imperative for companies around the world. What we'll then do is an overview of the traditional way that sales and operations planning is conducted. Now, we always have a wide spectrum of clients and prospects on our calls, our webinars, some in the small and medium business segment, others at the enterprise level. There is a range of different perspectives on the viability of S&OP, so I'm not presuming that there's a one-size-fits-all solution here for that, but I do think the topic of S&OP as it's been traditionally implemented, it's useful to do a review on that so that we can examine how effective it is or isn't at creating more agility and resilience in our supply chain environments. We'll talk through what our observations are on the limitations and some of the downside effects of the conventional ways of approaching S&OP. And then what we'll do is introduce this demand-driven philosophy, which I think is a foundational set of concepts that we can build on to create that agility and resilience that we're looking for. And then we'll talk about the path forward. So today is going to be mostly about the concepts, the techniques, the realities that we're dealing with. We've added a second webinar on the S&OP topic that will run in 2 weeks to provide some examples within our Intuiflow solution and bring those strategies and tactics to life in a little more specific way for you. We just, as we were planning for this event, realized that the content was going to start to overwhelm a 1-hour webinar, and so we figured it would be best to make it a little more bite-sized, do the concepts here today, and then we'll address some of the technical approaches when we get back together in a couple weeks from now. So let's get started. The market realities. This is one of the most critical charts as I look at the supply chain environment. This is a picture sourced by data from the US Federal Reserve that shows that US manufacturers over the past 25 years have not achieved improvements in their inventory turnover rates. This is done as inventory to sales, but suffice to say that both at the macro level here from the economic data from the Fed, but as well in our experience in talking with clients, some of the study analysis we've done on financially or publicly traded companies and their results, it bears out that we are really at the same place we were 25 years ago. And that kind of spans a big chunk of my career in information systems and business, my period with IBM and the like. You go back to the mid-90s, companies were running away from issues of legacy software maintenance, islands of automation, Y2K and the like, and they were buying into the ERP sales pitch, but also believing they were going to get better functionality and better business results. And the reality is that we're not seeing that. While there was a little bit of an improvement in the economic boom of the mid-2000 to 2010 era, It obviously turned around with the economic collapse that we had in 08 and 09. And you can even see a little blip there on the right where the onset of COVID had an impact in the 2020 timeframe. So suffice to say, we should be able to do better. And I think everybody understands that there's got to be ways to get to a better place. On the other hand, just looking at it from more the topics that we hear about in talking with clients around the world is, they're still struggling with inaccurate forecasts. They have tried to get those forecasts to be more accurate and the like, but have achieved limited results from that. They've also had experience with a lot of personnel or labor issues. In other words, during COVID and even now, people are finding staffing to be a major challenge in their environment, whether it's for the production environment or in supply chain planning roles. It's been difficult. We see clients that are seeing regular turnover in their supply chain planning communities. So that increases kind of the challenge of it all, because you're losing experience anytime some of those resources that have been on the team depart either into new jobs or leave the company or the like. Lots of firefighting going on. It was especially heavy during the critical periods of the pandemic, but even now there's been a number of lingering effects with constrained supply issues and other operational challenges that people are dealing with, causing this kind of firefighting. While all of this has been going on, companies are trying to find ways to compete in their various markets, and inevitably that leads to more items and more SKU proliferation. So that makes it more challenging with a less experienced workforce, and at times a shrinking workforce, because often companies look at supply chain planning as an expense item. They figure that if they can kind of shrink that cost, they will get some more profit out of it. So you've got less people trying to deal with more challenging conditions and more items at the same time, and it makes for a very, very difficult environment. And then obviously every company has its own workarounds, things that they're doing to try to alleviate some of the limitations that they have in their software environment. So, a lot of buzz in the market around agility and resilience. I went and looked at the definitions of both of those terms. Agility is marked by the ready ability to move with quick and easy grace. That kind of implies that you're flexible. You can turn on a dime if you need to. You can make adjustments very quickly, and it's not a very big challenge for you to do so. And then on the resilience side, that you're able to withstand and recover from difficult conditions. And I think every one of us would agree that if we had those two words describing, or those descriptions of our supply chain, we would absolutely feel that we were in a much, much better place. But when you think about this, the reality is that the real reason for driving towards agility and resilience is that we have to get comfortable with the idea that our future is uncertain, right? Embrace the certainty of an uncertain future. If we understand that that is the reality, that no matter how hard we try to predict what the future is going to bring to us, it's not really going to work out that way. If we can get comfortable with the idea that we have to make this shift in the way we think, then we're going to look at the problems we face in a different way, because so much of our conventional planning methods, MRP and the like, and traditional S&OP, is the idea that we can figure out what that future is going to be, line up all of our resources and suppliers and everything we do to meet that future. And then in reality, it doesn't work out that way. So we're really after trying to embrace this idea that it's not going to turn out the way we think. And so the more we do that, the more we will configure our business to be able to be agile and resilient and not totally aligned to a very specific definition of what the future is going to bring. So we want to talk about S&OP. And first thing we'd want to do is ask a couple polling questions. So we greatly appreciate your responses here. So Kevin, why don't we launch the first polling question? And if you wouldn't mind, just please respond. And as we get responses in, Kevin will share the results with us, and we'll see where we're at in terms of what portion of the audience is actually running S&OP. Some companies have not chosen to implement, or have chosen not to implement because of some of the concerns that they have with the level of effort it takes in their company and the scale of operations that they're at. Others have tried it and abandoned it. So a number of different strategies that are out there. So Kevin.
We still have responses coming in. Give me 1 second.
Okay.
Okay, I think that's everyone. So I'm going to end the poll and then share the results.
So about 70% are operating some form of an S&OP process. The biggest batch of responses were in a yes, but it's not consistent, which is kind of what I would have expected from the meetings we've had with clients over the years. You know, there's some companies that are really making a rigorous effort on it, others kind of in a so-so environment, and then some who've really not embraced it yet at all. So then let's ask the next question, if you wouldn't mind.
We'll give it a few more seconds. Okay, I'm going to end this poll and share the results.
Very good. Very interesting. Yeah, we expected a pretty wide response here. A lot of focus, obviously, on capacity requirements, especially in recent environments, inventory exposures, and things like that. So thanks so much. You can close the poll now, Kevin. Really appreciate those responses. So let's now go and take a look at what is it we're really trying to do with S&OP. I think if you look at it the way it's been conventionally taught and the like, there's a lot of outcomes that people are expecting, but this would be just kind of representative of what your thoughts were and what other people are looking at. You know, how can we align our materials and operations to what we expect to sell in the market? Before there was an S&OP, people were just kind of running operations and there was kind of a guess at what might happen. And it was really there to try to bring the organization together around what was the MRP plan going to look like? What was our master production schedule going to look like? Obviously trying to balance supply and demand, get those things in better synchronization, help us improve the management of our inventory and production resources, better transparency and coordination across the organization. I think this last bullet here about getting everyone on the same page was very, very much at the heart of it. Let's get the organization aligned, because if we do that, then we are going to be in better shape. It's not going to be like the left and the right hand don't know what each other are doing. And so the whole philosophy behind the S&OP process is really oriented to getting that company-wide alignment to that expected future. So if you think about it, and I'm going to go through this rather quickly, we're just, everyone kind of understands S&OP. We're just going to call out some of the key steps in the process and how that works. And then we'll come back around and show what the differentiations are going to be when we think about using this approach in more of a demand-driven manner. Forecasting, demand planning, supply planning, pre-S&OP, and then an S&OP meeting, executive S&OP that confirms the plan, and then we go out and implement. Forecasting obviously is kind of that crystal ball. We're going to use our historical data. We'll generate a statistical forecast based on that. There are just thousands of algorithms and tools out there that allow you to do that. There may be some external input from our sales department or other manual adjustments that are made. There's going to be some massaging going on to get the base forecast kind of to a level of maturity and you know, review that allows us to take it into the demand planning process. And these two steps kind of really synchronize, they're kind of blended together in a lot of companies. In other cases, demand planning is an organization unto itself, depending on the scale of your business. Demand planning is where you're really trying to take the forecast and now further adjust it and massage it to become what is that consensus view of what we are going to sell over the planning time horizon. And that can be as much as 2-3 years out in some cases. In other companies, it's a much shorter horizon, and that's going to depend, and we'll talk about that a little bit when we get into Demand Driven S&OP, which really tries to think about the idea of relevant ranges. Part of the process here is socialization. Part of it as well is looking at aggregations. Aggregating your forecast can be beneficial because it helps improve forecast accuracy, but it can also be counterproductive because sometimes it masks some of the dynamics and variability that given items within a given aggregation may experience. But suffice to say, what we're trying to get here in traditional S&OP is a consensus demand plan. Once we have that, then we can then turn our attention to building a consensus supply plan, right? What is the supply that we need, whether it's from our suppliers or from our own production resources and the like, to meet that demand story that we've reviewed and agreed and what have you. Are there impacts that we need to take back to the demand plan? For example, we've put a promotional campaign in and we know we wouldn't be able to supply that. So we wouldn't be able to realize all of that incremental volume. And therefore we have to bring the demand plan back to ground or something like that. Talk about identifying and agreeing the tactics to address constraints, risks. You know, there is some of that reality check going on within the supply planning activities to make sure that the demand plan is within range of what could be achievable. And there's a kind of a feedback loop that goes through that leads to kind of the pre-S&OP meeting where the functional leaders in the various departments are getting together, reviewing the demand and supply plans, talking about the puts and takes within all of that and trying to bring them into better alignment. There may be some review of historical results and achievement rates, really just trying to get everyone confident that, yeah, this is the plan we're going to take in. And at the end of the process, we're going to take it to our executive team and we're going to get their buy-off or, you know, validation that the plan is in fact ready to go. And this is what we're going to operate against. Sometimes there will be targets issued into the organization and key metrics that people are going to be chasing to help bring this plan to life. There will be estimates, you know, variances to budget, all these other factors on more of the financial side that I'm not going to spend time on today, come out of this activity. Then we go implement and we try to drive what we think is the way it's going to all work out as we go forward from there. But time and again, and I saw this during my IBM career as VP of operations for the consulting business, and we went through a lot of this stuff. We had some heavy duty S&OP process that we did as part of our fall plan for the subsequent business year. But inevitably, our forecasts aren't quite what we thought they would be. Our actual to forecast gaps are fairly substantial in certain areas, and others maybe that were pretty good. We might have been doing demand smoothing to try to get to a more manageable demand plan, and maybe there's more variation in the market. The plan starts breaking down. In fact, many companies have commented that by the time they finish the planning process and confirm that plan, they realize that many of the assumptions that they've made that support that plan are no longer valid or are changing dramatically. We find that there's supplier issues, we have production issues. You know, all of this is creating this noisy environment that is leading to lots of firefighting and, quite honestly, some lack of confidence that the planning effort, given all the time and effort it takes to create it, is really giving us value. Skepticism grows on the operations side, especially because they feel like sales never knows what they're doing and they're fraught with these challenges operationally. The sales guys always feel like, gosh, if the operations could get their act together, we'd be in a better place, yada, yada, yada. You can imagine and have probably experienced this in reality for yourself. People get frustrated. They start to tolerate the process instead of being viscerally bought into what we're trying to do. And I think in many, many cases, the feeling that companies express is one of, we don't know if it's really worth the effort, right? Are we really getting the value out of it? And I think part of it is that its assumption is that we are trying to plan to a predicted future. That's what planning is about, quite honestly. And maybe there's a way that we can turn our focus differently, which we'll talk about in Demand Driven S&OP, that might yield better results. But suffice to say, it can be rather challenging. Planning ahead means we're planning to a forecast, right? Well before the actual demand is known. Despite our efforts to make it as accurate as possible, things happen, things change, and therefore we don't really see the demand arrive the way we expected. We have suppliers who cause variation and are subject to variation, creating challenges. Our own operations cause and are subject to variation. And oftentimes, quite unfortunately, our firefighting that we execute to try to correct for these in-flight issues creates further stress and challenges within the organization. So, you know, it's a long quest. It can work, but a lot of people find there to be many areas for possible improvement. So we'd like to ask another question then, and this one relates to how satisfied are you about your process and whether it's helping you create agility.
We'll give it a few more seconds.
Very interesting. This says that 85% are dissatisfied to either a large or moderately large extent. And this is kind of par for the course, I think. This is kind of where people are evaluating their position. It just feels like there's a huge improvement opportunity that's out there. So thanks so much for your responses there. That's very interesting comments. All right, so given that there's some dissatisfaction, given that most of us are trying to some extent operate this process, what can we do to build greater agility and responsiveness into our operating model and capabilities? How can we deploy a planning process that actually creates more of that resilience that we're looking for in our environment? And I think it really means changing the approach, right? From focusing on celestial alignment or everything tied to that forecast, to focusing on how do we create true agility in our business model to respond to whatever the future brings. If we had infinite flexibility, infinite agility, we wouldn't need a forecast. We would have the capacity to meet whatever demand came in the door on a given day. Now, that's theoretically impossible to achieve, but it's good to think in that direction because I think it pushes our thinking into an area of strategies that would help us get to a better place. Instead of thinking about a single unified consensus plan, why don't we use a range of forecast assumptions as a vehicle for testing our agility? Where's the breaking points in our current model? Where do we need more capacity? Where may we need secondary suppliers for given components or whatnot to give us that more resilience that we're looking for? If we can pace our materials and operations to the true demand, in other words, we had infinite flexibility to the greatest extent possible, then what we would have is a truly agile and nimble supply chain. So we want to think about what are the ingredients we would need to get us to that point, and how can we look at our model to create those capabilities. Instead of having tightly coupled dependencies, everything within an MRP environment is heavily tied together. It's called a dependent planning system. If one thing at one end of the system changes, it ripples through entirely. And maybe there's ways through buffering and other techniques to create decoupling points where there isn't this direct impact anytime there is variation, where maybe it softens the blow like a break wall does out in the ocean, in terms of making the harbor more stable and the like. So we have to think about where we might be able to achieve some of these kind of benefits. And instead of this cross-functional celestial alignment, quest that becomes the kind of working mantra within S&OP. What if we could drift instead and move to an exception management approach, one more like a pilot in a commercial airliner who is rarely actually flying the plane, but monitoring the dashboard, monitoring the radar, monitoring the other instruments to identify and focus his time or her time on the exceptions that we could deal with. If we could do that, then S&OP by definition would become a lighter weight, more achievable level of effort, one that's actually focused more critically on those things that really matter versus trying to get all these details lined up in that celestial fashion that I'm talking about. So this is where we want to talk about what the Demand Driven Institute describes as a demand-driven adaptive enterprise model. And the idea here is that what we're trying to do is get a lens of the full spectrum of activities that we're going to be involved in. The idea here is that on the left side, we want to have our operating model. We'll talk about that. That's how we run our plant, how we get supply in, how we manage materials, how we manage production and the like, to be able to pace to actual demand. The more we can move in this environment, by definition, the more agile we are becoming. On the right side, every business is evolving, and so you have to look forward. And at the adaptive end, you're looking at long-range strategies, like do we need a new plant somewhere, or do we have to make major changes in capital equipment? Are we going to open up new supply or sales channels that are going to influence our environment? So those tend to be more about business plan parameters, where as we move to the left side and we're pacing our operations, it's more about how do we configure that model to give us that kind of agility and resilience that we're looking for. And the demand-driven S&OP process really becomes the bridge between those two worlds. Adaptive enterprise, it kind of evokes that idea of it agile and resilient. And what we're really going to focus on in today's session is some of the elements that we're going to tactically focus on to get our operating model more agile. If we do that, we are more able to pace to the real demand in the market that we're facing. We are less subject to the vagaries of inaccurate forecasts and things of that nature. So it's going to ask different questions now. How do we configure our operating model to become more agile? We'll talk about that in the next few charts. Where are there sources of variation and disruption in our environment that are going to cause challenges? When we're planning to a consensus demand plan, we're really kind of maybe not emphasizing enough the variation and disruptions that may occur in our environment and giving ourselves more resilience to deal with those. What can we learn from our past period performance? There is always insights we should be able to gain. It's kind of doing the Monday morning review of the game of what we could have done differently had we known what was coming at us. Where do we apply and how do we configure buffers? Buffering is a core concept behind the demand-driven philosophy that can be in both stock buffers as well as time and capacity. They create more agility because they help manage variation, which is, I think, the bigger priority. It's not so much about your forecast, it's about what is the variation we experience and how can we do a better job managing them. What are the range of conditions we must be ready to address? If we knew the range of conditions, the highs and the lows and the different variants, then we'd be in a very much stronger position to address them if we configure our model accordingly. And finally, can we do some stress testing to test that the models that we've got have been improved and give us the ability to handle a range of future scenarios? So speaking of ranges, the Demand Driven Institute is very heavy on this idea of relevant ranges. An example would be, things that are going to not happen for 26 to say 52 weeks from now, if I have short lead times of 7 to 30 days within my operating environment. And further out in the future, I may be interested, but I shouldn't be making course adjustments just because something might happen 9 months from now that we're not sure about. So we want to think about the horizons that we're working within. When we think about the demand-driven operating model, obviously we can learn from the past. We have to address the current present environment, which is kind of what people are now calling sales and operations execution, and the tactical future. And I think when you think about this, it's typically your longest lead time item, your longest decoupled lead time item. If you factor that in and you're looking within this lens, then that's really kind of the arena that demand-driven S&OP is going to play into. Oftentimes that's a shorter horizon, maybe 13 to 26 weeks in most environments. But the actions and the resulting thoughts that we're going to carry in a DDS and OP environment, by definition, will be different than those that are more in the adaptive end, where you're thinking larger grain, longer term strategies and actions. You're not really trying to adjust what you're doing today. So it's important to keep this in mind, because relevant ranges also help limit the amount of things that we need to focus on. If we know we've got a 13-week planning horizon, then worrying about things that are 20 weeks away is not really a good thing to do, because it's just going to waste energy. That event 20 weeks from now is likely to change between now and then anyway. So let's focus our attention at the kind of the actions that are really going to affect us within this tactical range that we're describing here. That's one key differentiator. We really want to stay on that tactical horizon. The other thing we have to understand is that not every company is the same. There is a spectrum of material management methods that are employed in any given company. Everything from the make to order side, where at the far end of this, you have no common components. Everything is bespoke to a given client's request. And so it's really about managing your production and scheduling. Where at the other end of the spectrum, everything is made to stock. You know, we're a beverage producer or something like that. Almost all of our materials would be in a make to stock orientation. And so we have to understand that where we fall on a given spectrum at a given plant within our business is going to vary from different environments, right? And what's important about that is to understand that the tactics we'll deploy to create agility will vary as well. If I'm on the far left end, pure make to order, everything is bespoke to a given client's request, then I have no common componentry. And we talked about this in the last webinar. In that case, if I'm going to create more agility and resilience, it's all about how I manage my production environment. Maybe even my engineering and, the design phase of activities for a given client's environment. So we're going to think about how can we insert time and capacity buffers within that scheduling and production environment to give us the greatest odds of success at reaching the client's promise state and request states. We'll talk about how we interpret those and configure those to protect ourselves. It's going to have a lot to do with the variations we experience in that environment. It's going to have a lot to do with ensuring that our standards are correct on things like run rates and setup times and the like. But we're going to think about agility in a different lens if we're on the left side of this chart than if we're on the right side, where, like in a consumer goods, food and beverage environment, many of your end items are going to be stocked. They're going to be sold on a very short promise response time to the market. In other words, I give you an order today, you ship it tomorrow, kind of a situation in where constant availability is critical. And in that case, you're going to be holding inventory. And through the use of concepts like DDMRP buffers, you're going to configure those buffers to ensure they are addressing the consumption pattern and the variation a given item experiences. So just got to keep this in mind, that the way we address this is going to be dependent on your operating environment and which of the tools and techniques we can utilize to create that greater agility. This is another key chart from the DDI, and I really like it because it takes a look at these different buffer types and helps understand, if we are utilizing these tactics, where do we get leverage of them? How do they give us a play to get to more agility? On the left, we'll talk about stock buffers. We know from the standpoint of where their planning position is that they may represent opportunities for inventory reduction and working capital reduction, and that's obviously a key part of the expectations of an S&OP process. At the same time, they're going to show us where we've got the greatest exposures for services. Those buffers that have been consistently penetrated down too deeply, or who have inadequate safety coverage in their red zones, are going to represent model changes that we want to implement to help protect that service that we're trying to achieve to the market. Again, we're back on the right side of this chart. We're trying to make sure stock is always available. And so if we have items that have chronically been exposed to stockouts, then obviously we need to rethink how we are configuring our buffers. And this all goes back to this idea of model configuration with DDS and OP, right? Is we're looking for how to create that agility, because if part of why we're not seeing adequate service levels, most likely it's because we don't have proper coverage for the variation that we're experiencing on those stock items that we're trying to maintain. So we see improvement opportunities to reduce our working capital. We see improvement opportunities to address service level exposures, and we focus on gaining that agility through these stock buffers. On the scheduling and production scheduling side, then we think in two terms. Capacity buffers means that I've got more than enough capacity to meet the expected demand. In other words, I think of my red, yellow, green in a different lens, where I want to be down where I've got enough reserve capacity to address issues where variation occurs, right? I become more agile if I've got the ability to make up for maybe a machine went down, or maybe our constraint has an issue, or whatever. It gives me the vehicles to understand how much excess capacity do I have. That may even represent an opportunity to exploit that for more revenue and profit growth. Or it's a way to help ensure that I'm not going to disrupt my service to the market because I'm too redlined out. You know, if I've got every plant resource scheduled to 100% of capacity, if anything changes, I've got to stop orders, do firefighting and things like that. We want reserve capacity to help us deal with the variation that occurs in that environment. And then time buffers are really there to help us manage the fact that variation will occur. And if we're trying to make our promise dates, the more we're able to appropriately utilize protective time buffers within our routings, then we improve our ability to hit our promise dates and improve those achievement rates. Those give us more agility because now we are not caught in a real problem where we've got to shut down or change the whole schedule or whatever. We are now able to hit the marks that we're trying to in terms of our due date performance and factors like that. Where we stand in each of these pictures is an indication of how much agility do we have, where our downside risk, where are the upside opportunities, and how do we ensure that we can exploit those to the greatest extent going forward. Now, this comes to the idea of ranges again, and thinking about what is the range of scenarios that we need to be able to support. If we're just planning to one demand plan, we have one view of the future, and our buffers would give us a little bit of an idea of how much upside and downside potential we have in those, you know, because of the way the buffer logic works and the like. But perhaps too, we should be looking at creating a high, medium, and low scenario, or three different views of what the future may be, where maybe the product mix underneath the overall revenue outlooks changes as a result, to be able to evaluate where the exposures are. And there's, I think, a tremendous amount of power from this in being able to give you the insights you need to know where you're at. That may result in things like a need for more capital equipment. It may also indicate, hey, we're going to maybe discontinue some products that are problematic because they're very difficult to manage. They're not giving us much profit. When we do have to run them in production, it's always a crisis because the supply components that are unique to that item that doesn't have a high movement rate are difficult to achieve. You I'm sure understand all the various scenarios that are out there, but we're starting to now look at resilience as the operating paradigm and configure our business in a manner to achieve that. So we can run different scenarios, we can test them, evaluate them. Maybe we don't do this every month, but maybe we do them every quarter as a way of stress testing the system and then utilizing that to gain a better understanding of how we operate, where the inflection points are, and getting ourselves to a better position. So the demand-driven adaptive model, I think, is a great proxy for how you do this. This may not be everyone's favorite chart, or maybe you really love it. I find it very easy to get my head around the idea that we're going to try to get agility into our model so that we can pace as much as possible to true demand, because that's the most accurate signal we're ever going to get. As a byproduct of that, we lose some of the negative impacts when we have inaccurate forecasts. So building that agility in, the more we can be truly demand driven, the more we stand to be in a better place. And as we look out into the future now, we understand how our operating model works, and we can start to envision, I think, and see a better way forward on those longer range decisions around the adaptive enterprise, where you're looking at new plant capabilities or various other major investments that a company may make as it continues to grow and evolve going forward. Some of the key outputs we're going to take from a DDS&OP process. It's going to be that what are the configuration changes to our operating model? What do we need to do to create more agility and resilience based on what we've learned from the past and what we expect is coming? We're going to use our forecast to help generate sales, revenue, and profit projections. We can look at those across a range of scenarios as well. We can generate the supplier projections and requirements out to them so that we can be in a more collaborative environment with our suppliers. We're going to have working capital projections for plants, for distribution centers. We can look at those by location, by product family, by a range of different dimensions, and those are very helpful from a financial planning standpoint. We're going to be able to do rough cut capacity planning and understand if our shift schedules and our resource requirements are really in line with what range of conditions we may be expected to address. That can also include labor and workforce requirements and a number of factors like that. I think probably more importantly than anything is it gives us the ability to assess our supply chain risks, what exposures we have, and the actions and changes that we would need to make to create a greater degree of resilience and agility out of the environment. I think the benefits are pretty substantial, right? It puts our focus on agility and responsiveness in the market. If we're doing range forecasting, it enables us to stress test our capabilities ahead of time before we get out there. And that allows us to make better decisions that more in line with what I think S&OP is really oriented to help us achieve. It does also allow us to focus on where the exceptions are because, and you'll see in the next webinar when we go into our solution and how we bring these to life, you'll see those items that need configuration changes or where there are issues from a campaign or a promotional event that may need a corrective action and things of that nature. Because we are less dependent on a flawed demand signal, we will get better results. We will get what the market's going to deliver to us. And I think companies that have started down this path are starting to feel like they're gaining a better grip on a process that's going to deliver value for them as they go forward. Probably more than anything, I think, is that you get the benefit of a reduced level of effort. It's just too hard right now. And, you know, I would comment that I think in many ways, software companies have tried to answer the requests that they get from customers, and we need all these different buttons, knobs, and features and switches in our software. Oftentimes, we kind of go overboard on that. And if we made it lighter weight and focused on the things that really matter, we would get leverage out of the time and efforts that we put into this and get to a better place. So in the next session, we'll go into more of the how-tos in the software and how we bring these to life. But hopefully these concepts, the idea of how we use stock, time, and capacity buffers to gain better agility into our operating model. When we do that, we become more able to pace to the really coming to us in the market. By definition, we are becoming more agile and resilient in the process. So Kevin, why don't we ask the final polling question?
We'll give
Kevin,
it a
you
few
there?
more seconds.
Okay. Wow. I'm delighted to see that. That is very, very good to see. And thank you for that. I do believe that these strategies can move us in a very good direction. So thanks for sharing that, Kevin. That there's a way here to get to a better place. Now, I in preparing for the webinar today, I felt that there is more we can do to also communicate these ideas in a better way. So we're going to continue to work towards that as we go forward. Let's just kind of wrap up here. Couple things, and then we'll go to question and answer. Well, actually, Kevin, if there's polling or questions from the audience, why don't we address those now before we get into the
Sounds good.
closing?
The first question we have, Eric, is we have overdue supply orders. How are those considered in the S&OP plan?
Wow, that's a great one. Overdue supply orders, you could have the same thing on the demand side. Many companies are still dealing with this because of the supply constraints that they've been dealing with. You have to factor those in. You have to come up with some assumptions as to when they will arrive. The only way you can really do that is through obviously some supplier collaboration. Look at what the supplier's been able to achieve from a run rate standpoint, and when will they be able to bring those up to snuff or up to standard. I think there's no real quick answer to that, but you definitely want to factor in how you're going to be able to remediate that in your plan, because if you don't, you are going to potentially over commit to buying non-constrained items that depend on that constrained supply that you've got the back orders for to be consumed. So we've run a webinar on that whole supply constrained supply environment, and we can share that with you as well. But that's going to require more than anything supplier collaboration and getting to a true confident expectation as how quickly you can resolve that, because some of that's going to carry forward into your overall plan. Other questions?
Okay, yes, we do. Some customers are pushing out their orders due to market slowdown. How can we address that in our S&OP?
That to me is a great example of why you want to run a different range scenario. In other words, let's say we're assuming demand is going to slow down. That means on a period by period basis, the demand will not be as great as it had been. It will help you understand potential excess inventory exposures you would have in your current environment. That's exactly why we want those kind of range estimates, because they would give you an idea to understand how much elasticity do we have in our current environment. And we'll bring an illustration of that to the next webinar.
Okay, we do have one more question. How can we improve supplier collaboration to improve alignment?
Yeah, I think one of the key things, obviously, you have to have a good dialogue. I think at times I've seen that companies have the supplier relationship is managed by somebody in procurement, and they're really kind of the one that's selecting vendors and certifying them, things like that. And then the planners are working with them on a period by period basis. You really need to be able to get to, in my mind, the most critical thing is the run rates. What can you deliver us over a time period reliably? And then utilizing that information, if, for example, that is below the rate of demand you're expecting that parent item, that item is going to go into its parent items and the like, then you have to really take a hard look at constraining some of those production schedules in your master production schedule to a more limited rate of capability. So to me, have the business relationship, try to get to, hey, we're going to be able to ship you 20,000 units a month on this kind of a paradigm, or something that you can turn it into a rate. If you turn it into a rate, you can then utilize it as a resource, in essence, a constraint within your rough cut capacity planning model to help limit the amount of other things you're buying. Too often companies are not able to recognize this, and they buy non-constrained items because the demand says it's there, not realizing that they're not going to consume all that material because there's one component that's missing and it's going to be forever late for the next 6 months. So why don't we start to slow down our rate of acquisition of those non-constrained items to what rate we can get to? It's all about getting to a rate of supply over a time period, and something that you and the vendor are confident they can achieve. And you've got actions to help grow that. And if it's not adequate, then you've got to obviously look out for other points of supply and other ways of dealing with that. Any further questions then, Kevin?
That is all we have.
Okay. So great. Appreciate all the responses to the webinar on the polling questions. Very interesting feedback that you've provided. We are going to run part 2 of sales and operations planning on August 9th. That's a change to our schedule. We were going to use that slot for the production scheduling webinar, but instead we're going to do a second session on S&OP. And I think for good reason. There's a lot of interest out here, and there's some really important concepts that we're trying to get across. So please mark your calendars for that event. It'll be at the same time of day as this one was run at 11 a.m. Eastern time. And then we'll finish this series on August 23rd with a dip into the production scheduling and operations environment and talking about tactics and techniques that we can deploy to create more agility in the production scheduling environment. I would really encourage you to utilize the content and insights at the Demand Driven Institute. So much of what we believe will help us get to a better place in terms of agility and resilience are basic concepts that are developed by the Demand Driven Institute. It's not about just DDMRP or just demand driven capacity scheduling. It's about using these tools correctly within our environment. No matter if we are heavy make to order, heavy make to stock, there are tactics that they are articulating that can be useful that fit well into your environment. And you really need to go into it with that kind of a lens. So a lot of great content out there that you can access and utilize. And then finally, just say thanks to everyone for your participation today. Hope you enjoyed the session. We will be distributing the link to the recording as well as a PowerPoint, the copy of the PowerPoint presentation for your reference. Thanks again, and we'd be more than happy to help you on your demand-driven journey. So feel free to reach out to us at DD Tech, and y'all have a good day. Thanks, everyone.